Beggar looks at the single billionaire's daughters and says, "I can be their mother and help you." His response touches everyone. The sound Julian Wexler cherished most in the world was the silence of a closed deal, the soft click of a luxury pen on paper, the firm handshake, the respectful murmur of his executives. At that moment, in his office atop a skyscraper that pierced the clouds, the only sound was the almost imperceptible hum of the climate control system and the rhythmic tap of his fingers on the polished mahogany desk. Everything was in perfect order. Charts went up, stocks gained value, the empire grew. For Julian, the world was a complex equation that he and only he knew how to solve. This relentless logic governed his life. It was the armor he had put on the day his wife left, and he had never taken it off. Work was his refuge, a battlefield where victories were measurable and losses were calculable. Feelings did not fit on the spreadsheet. The shrill buzz of the intercom was a dissonant note in that symphony of control. He frowned, irritation creasing the corners of his eyes. "Mr. Wexler, Mrs. Albright insists on speaking with you. She is quite upset." Julian sighed, a dry, impatient sound. Mrs. Albright was the nanny, the 7th or perhaps the 8th in the last year. He had lost count. It was a logistical problem, a failure in domestic administration that distracted him from more important matters. "Send her in," he said, his voice sharp. The door opened and a middle-aged woman, her face red with frustration, entered with firm steps. She did not wait to be invited to sit. She stopped before the colossal desk that separated her world from his. "I quit, Mr. Wexler." Julian tilted his head, his gaze cold and analytical. "Is the salary not sufficient? I can increase it by 20%. Problem solved." He was already turning back to his computer screen, considering the matter closed. The woman let out a short, humorless laugh. "Solved? Do you think everything can be solved with money?" She gestured, her hand trembling slightly. "I can't take it anymore. The house feels like a museum, and those girls, those two little angels, they are fading away." The mention of his daughters made Julian look at her again, a spark of annoyance in his eyes. Emma and Sophie, twins, 5 years old. Blonde hair like golden threads and blue eyes that once mirrored their mother's shine. These were facts, biographical data. He loved them. Of course he did. The proof was everywhere. The secure mansion, the best toys money could buy, the impeccable clothes, the organic food prepared by a chef. He gave them the best. What else could a child possibly need? "They have everything," he stated, his voice low and dangerously calm. "They have nothing," the nanny exploded, her voice echoing in the silent room. "They don't have a father. They have a CEO who lives in the same house." She leaned over the desk, her desperation overcoming her fear. "You treat your daughters like appointments in your schedule. They need affection, not orders." The sentence hung in the air, charged with a truth that Julian refused to process. To him, it was absurd. Affection was an unstable variable, impossible to quantify. Orders, on the other hand, produced results. Bath time, mealtime, bedtime, efficiency. That was how things worked. "Your sentimentality is interfering with your function, Mrs. Albright. I appreciate your services. The personnel department will handle your termination." The woman looked at him for a long moment, and what Julian saw in her eyes was not anger, but pity, a deep pity, which offended him more than any shout. She shook her head, defeated, and turned around. Before leaving, she stopped at the door and looked back. "They still call for their mother at night, you know, and you are never there to hear it." The door closed. The silence returned, but now it was different. It was contaminated, heavy. Julian felt a nagging pang, something he quickly classified as irritation at the need to start a new hiring process. Another useless task in his already packed day. Hours later, he arrived home. The mansion was, as always, impeccable and silent. The lights turned on automatically as he passed, revealing vast corridors and rooms decorated with a cold elegance. There was not a toy out of place, a drop of paint on the wall, a fingerprint on the glass. It was the perfect house for a man who detested surprises. He found his daughters in the living room, They were sitting side by side on a huge white sofa, too large for their small bodies. Each held a tablet, their pale faces illuminated by the blue light of the screen. Their straight blonde hair fell perfectly over their shoulders, and their expensive dresses were without a single wrinkle. They looked like two porcelain dolls on display in a shop window. "Emma! Sophie!" he greeted, his voice echoing in the silence. Two heads lifted, two pairs of blue eyes, identical and empty, blinked in his direction. "Hi, Daddy!" they said in unison, their small voices thin and emotionless. They did not run to hug him. They did not shout with joy. They just watched him, waiting for an order, an instruction. Julian felt that uncomfortable pang again. "Did you do your homework?" he asked, the only interaction that occurred to him. They nodded. "Did you have dinner?" They nodded again. He stood there in the middle of the room, a stranger in his own home. He looked at his daughters, so quiet and obedient, and what he saw was confirmation that his method worked. They were well-behaved children. What did the nanny want? For them to run through the house screaming, to dirty the Persian rugs? He gave them comfort. He gave them security. Was that not enough? For him, it had to be. It was all he had to offer. But for a brief second, as the light from the crystal chandelier reflected in their clear eyes, Julian had the feeling of looking at a perfectly still surface of water, with no idea of the darkness hiding just below. He did not see the lack of sparkle in their eyes. He did not hear the silence where there should have been laughter. He saw only order, calm, the proof that everything was under control, everything in its proper place, except for the hearts of two little girls who, day after day, were learning not to feel so they would not feel the lack of anything. And Julian, the architect of that empty fortress, had no idea. The next morning was a chaotic dissonance in Julian Wexler's perfectly orchestrated life. Without the calming presence of a nanny, the silent mansion turned into a labyrinth of small crises. Julian, with the phone pressed to his shoulder, was negotiating a multi-hundred-million-dollar merger with the Singapore branch, while unsuccessfully trying to tie a bow in Emma's hair. His fingers, so skilled at signing contracts and dissecting spreadsheets, were clumsy and useless at this delicate task. "No, Takahashi, clause 4.2b is non-negotiable. Sophie, where is your other shoe? I don't care. Find it now," he growled, alternating between the ruthless CEO and the exasperated father. The girls watched him with a quietness that bordered on apathy, sitting at the untouched breakfast table. They were dressed, but not ready. They existed in the same space as him, but did not share his panic. They were just two small objects that needed to be managed before he could focus on what really mattered. The nanny agency, despite its promises of elite service, failed him. "We are evaluating the best candidates for your family's profile, Mr. Wexler," said an overly polished voice on the other end of the line. He hung up. He had no time for excuses. He had a 2-hour window before his next in-person meeting. 2 hours to take his daughters somewhere they could not destroy anything or get hurt. The park. The word echoed in his mind like a punishment. The drive in his luxury sedan was made in a heavy silence. Julian mentally reviewed the negotiation points, his lips moving without sound, while the girls looked out the tinted windows, watching a vibrant world they were not a part of. When they arrived, the sensory assault was immediate. The air was thick with the smell of cut grass and popcorn. Sharp screams of joy and cries of tantrums mixed into an anarchic soundtrack. For Julian, it was the sound of disorder, of inefficiency. He held Emma's and Sophie's hands, feeling their small, cold fingers in his. They did not pull him toward the playground, as other children did with their parents. They hesitated at the edge of the lawn, as if facing a rough sea, afraid of drowning. He led them to the swings, the only equipment that seemed minimally contained. "Sit down, I will push," he said, his tone more like a project manager's than a father's. He pushed them mechanically, a steady, lifeless rhythm. Push for Sophie, glance at his watch, push for Emma, check emails on his phone. His mind was miles away, in boardrooms of glass and steel. He did not notice the way the girls clung to the chains, their empty gazes fixed on the horizon, going up and down without a hint of joy. They were the best-dressed and saddest children in the park. It was then that his phone rang, the discreet professional melody that signaled an important call. It was about the hostile takeover, the final hunt. "Stay here, do not move from there," he ordered, the warning delivered with his back turned, as he was already walking away toward a quieter area. Julian dove into his element. His voice, previously tense and irritated, became an instrument of power. Calm, precise, lethal. He paced back and forth under the shade of an oak tree, dismantling his opponent's arguments, exploiting weaknesses, cornering his prey. He was building an empire, brick by brick, call by call. Meanwhile, on the swings, the motion stopped. Emma and Sophie watched their father's back, a distant, focused silhouette, and knew they had become invisible. It was a familiar feeling. Holding hands, an instinctive gesture of mutual protection, they slid off the seats. Their eyes scanned the chaotic landscape and found a point of silence. Near the exposed root of an old tree, a woman was sitting on the grass. Her posture was relaxed, her clothes simple and worn. She was not looking at a phone, nor at the children running around. She had a thick, covered book open in her lap, and her attention was entirely on the pages. There was an aura of contentment and peace around her, something so different from the tension that emanated from their father that it acted like a beacon. Drawn by this quietness, the twins began to walk toward her. Each step was hesitant. The world had taught them not to bother, not to make noise, not to ask for anything. But curiosity, one of the few childhood emotions that still survived in them, pushed them forward. The woman, Margot, felt their approach before she heard it. It was a subtle shift in the atmosphere, the presence of two small hesitations. She slowly lifted her eyes from the book. What she saw broke her heart in a silent, profound way. Two girls who looked like angels from a Renaissance painting, with their golden hair and immaculate dresses, but with eyes that carried the weight of an old soul. There was no sparkle, no hint of the mischief that should exist in 5-year-olds. There was only a solemn seriousness, an emptiness that the expensive clothes could not hide. She saw, with the clarity of her years as a teacher, that these children were starving, not for food, but for something much more essential. Emma, always the first to test the waters, stopped a few feet away and pointed to the book. "Is it a princess story?" Margot offered a small smile, a gesture that did not frighten but invited. "Not exactly. It's about a secret garden, hidden behind a wall, that no one had taken care of for a long time." Sophie took a step to join her sister. "Was it dead?" she whispered. "People thought so," Margot replied, her voice as soft as the rustling of the leaves above them. "But it was just sleeping, waiting for someone to find the key and take care of it so it could bloom again." The girls fell silent, processing the idea. A sleeping garden. The metaphor was perhaps too complex for them, but the feeling behind it, of something lost waiting to be found, resonated somewhere deep inside. On the other side of the lawn, Julian ended the call. Victory was his. A fleeting, predatory smile crossed his face. He turned, ready to gather his responsibilities and leave, and his world stopped. The swings were empty. A primal panic, the one emotion he could not control, hit him like a punch. His mind projected terrible scenarios in a fraction of a second. He shouted their names, his voice higher than he intended. Then he saw them. Next to that woman, a stranger, a poor-looking woman, sitting on the ground as if she had nowhere to go. Relief was immediately swallowed by a wave of cold fury, the audacity, the presumption. He strode across the lawn, a storm brewing on his face. "Emma, Sophie, come here, now." His voice was a weapon, and the girls flinched as if they had been struck. They ran to him, the brief moment of peace shattered, and hid behind his legs, clutching the expensive fabric of his trousers. Julian stood before Margot, looking down at her, his posture exuding power and contempt. "What do you think you're doing? Stay away from my daughters." Margot did not shrink. She remained seated, looking up at him with a disconcerting calm. Her gaze passed over him and settled on the two little blonde heads peeking from behind his legs. There was an infinite sadness in that look, but also an unshakable strength. With a serenity that was, in itself, a reprimand, she spoke, her voice no louder than a conversation, but with the weight of an irrefutable truth. "Margot, they need a mother." The words hung in the thin air between them. It was not an attack, it was a diagnosis, a precise and painful diagnosis of the disease that was corroding his family. Julian felt as if he had been slapped. All his power, all his wealth, all his logic were reduced to nothing before that simple observation. Rage choked him, but beneath it, something else stirred. A pang of panic, of recognition. In a pure reflex, a verbal deflection born from countless corporate battles where attack is the best defense, he spat out a question loaded with sarcasm and a desperation he would never admit. "Julian, would you do that for us?" It was meant to be a humiliation, a way to expose the absurdity of the situation. You, who have nothing, think you can offer them something. But her answer contained no sarcasm, no hesitation, no self-interest. She looked him directly in the eyes, and for the first time in years, Julian felt completely transparent. His walls of money and power turned to glass. "Margot, with all my heart," silence. The noise of the park, the screams, the laughter, everything faded away. Julian stood there, paralyzed. The concept was alien. In his world, everything had a price, a contract, an exchange. Hearts were not part of the negotiations. Offers were not made with everything. They were made with percentages, with clauses, with guarantees. The absolute sincerity of this woman, who had nothing to gain, was a glitch in the system, an anomaly his brain could not process. Without another word, he turned. He grabbed his daughter's hands with more force than necessary and marched away, his retreat as disorderly as an escape. The drive home was a silent torture. The car's interior, usually a sanctuary of control, felt claustrophobic. Her phrase ricocheted in his mind, "With all my heart, with all my heart." It was Emma's soft voice that finally broke the spell. "She seemed nice, Daddy," Sophie added in a whisper, as if sharing a secret. "I liked her." Their words, so simple and innocent, were like small stones thrown against his fortress. He did not answer, but something inside him had been irrevocably shaken. That night he tried to work in his home office, but the words on the documents blurred, forming the woman's phrase. The image of her serene eyes haunted him. A woman with nothing had offered him everything, and he, a man who supposedly had everything, did not know what to do with it. The next day, the situation had not changed. The agency was still searching. Julian's meetings were piling up. Practical desperation gnawed at his patience, and the memory of the woman in the park persisted, no longer just as an annoying memory, but as an impossible and tempting solution. It was crazy. It was irresponsible. But it was an option. Driven by an impulse that defied all his logic, he drove back to the park. His heart pounded with a mix of anxiety and self-loathing. He found her in the same spot, as if she had been waiting for him. He stopped in front of her, feeling like a fool. "I need help with the girls," he said, without preamble. She looked up at him and nodded, her face calm. "My name is Margot." "Julian," he replied. "What's your story?" He needed facts to anchor this insane decision. Margot told her story with a simplicity that made it even more powerful. The years as a teacher, the love and dedication to her sick mother, the way the world kept spinning while hers stopped, the loss of her job, her home, her security. She did not ask for pity, she just presented the facts. "When my mother passed, I realized I had lost everything that connected me to the world," she explained, her gaze fixed on a distant point. "Everything, except the hope that I could still be useful." She then turned to him, and her dignity was an armor. "I don't want charity, Mr. Wexler, just a chance. I know how to care for children. It's the only thing I know how to do with all my heart." The phrase again. This time, however, it did not paralyze him. It landed in his pragmatic mind like a credential. Teacher, qualified, desperate, cheap and without many demands. It was a high-risk transaction, but the potential reward, the immediate solution to his logistical problem, was high. He was not offering help. He was making an investment. He did not tell her about his wife, about the crushing loneliness disguised as work, about the fear that he was failing his own daughters. He kept his walls up. "I have a room in the back, with a separate entrance," he said, his voice cold and businesslike. "You can stay there, take care of the girls during the day, prepare their meals, help with their tasks. When I arrive, your work is done." He paused, emphasizing the boundary. That's all. A verbal contract, clear terms, no emotional involvement. It was the only way he knew how to operate. Margot looked at this powerful, broken man, at the father who loved his daughters in the only way he knew how, by providing. And she understood. She was not being invited into a family. She was being hired to fill a functional gap. But for her, it was the key to the sleeping garden. She nodded, just once. "Thank you for the opportunity." Julian felt a cold relief. Problem solved. He gave her his address and instructions, then turned and left, convinced he had just made a shrewd and unconventional business decision. He had no idea that he had just handed the key to his fortress to the one person capable of opening it from the inside. Margot arrived at 8 o'clock sharp as instructed. She did not dare to ring the bell of the imposing front door, but went discreetly to the service entrance, as if she already knew the unspoken rules of the place. Julian met her there, an austere figure in his immaculate environment. She held a single canvas bag, so worn it seemed to have traveled across continents and decades, containing whatever was left of her life. He did not offer to help carry it. He led her through a service corridor, a parallel universe to the grandeur of the main house. As they walked, Margot caught glimpses through open doors. Marble floors that reflected the cold light like a frozen lake. Walls adorned with abstract art that looked more like investments than sources of joy. Designer furniture arranged with a geometric precision that forbade comfort. It was a house that screamed wealth and whispered loneliness. Her room was at the back, deliberately isolated. It was clean, functional, and completely devoid of personality. A narrow bed, a small dresser, a window that looked out onto a brick wall covered in ivy. Julian placed a laminated sheet of paper on the dresser. It was a schedule. "This is the girls' schedule," he said, his voice as cold as the marble in the hall. "Every activity, every meal, every transition is detailed here, Sippy, in 15-minute intervals. Your function is to execute this schedule without deviation. Their diet is rigidly controlled by a nutritionist. The meals are planned and are in the refrigerator. You just need to heat them. Your responsibilities begin when they wake up and end precisely at 8 in the evening, when they must be in bed. Your job is to care for them, exclusively for them. Do not worry about the general cleaning. We have a team for that. Just keep their space in order. Am I clear?" It was an operations manual, not a welcome. He was programming her, not hiring her. Margot looked at the schedule, at the lives of 2 5-year-old children dissected into blocks of time, and felt a deep sadness. Then she looked at Julian, at the armor of control he wore to keep the world, and perhaps his own feelings, at a distance. She nodded, her voice soft. "Crystal clear, Mr. Wexler." Satisfied, he left her. Alone in the silent room, Margot unpacked her bag. There were few clothes, all worn but clean and carefully folded. There was a picture frame with a faded photo of an older woman smiling, her mother, and there were 2 hardcover books. That was all. She arranged her things and then stood in the middle of the room, listening to the oppressive silence of the house. It was not a peaceful silence. It was a vacuum, the absence of sound, of life. And she understood that her job there would not be just to follow a schedule. In the first few days, Margot moved with the discretion of a ghost. She learned the ways of the house, the location of everything, the silent habits of her 2 small charges. Emma and Sophie were like delicate trinkets. They spoke when spoken to, ate what was served to them, and played with their expensive toys without a shred of enthusiasm. They watched her with cautious curiosity, their clear eyes registering her every move. Previous nannies had tried to break the ice with forced activities and shrill smiles. Margot did the opposite. She gave them space, offering them the rare gift of presence without demands. Her first rebellion was silent and olfactory. On the 3rd morning, ignoring the pre-packaged meals, she decided to make pancakes. The state-of-the-art kitchen, a stainless steel laboratory that was rarely used for more than reheating. was awakened. The smell of butter melting in the pan, followed by the sweet aroma of the batter cooking, began to spread through the house like a caress. It was a smell that did not belong in that place, a smell of lazy Sunday mornings, of childhood. Emma and Sophie entered the kitchen, drawn by the fragrance. They stopped at the doorway, watching. Margot did not turn around immediately. She poured the batter, waited for the bubbles to form, and with a flick of her wrist flipped the pancake in the air. Only then did she look at them and smile, a small, genuine smile. "Good morning. Are you hungry?" They nodded, their eyes fixed on the golden stack growing on the plate. That morning, they did not just eat, they savored. The house began to change in other ways. The silence, once absolute, was punctuated by new sounds. Margot sang. It was not a performance, it was a hum, almost forgotten folk melodies that she would croon while polishing silverware or watering the houseplants that everyone seemed to have forgotten. The sound was so soft it blended into the background, but unlike the hum of the air conditioning, it had warmth, it had soul. One day, while cleaning the tall living room windows, she was humming, and Sophie, who was on the floor with a puzzle, stopped and just listened, her head tilted as if deciphering a long-lost language. Julian noticed. How could he not? He would come home, and the air was no longer sterile. It held the scent of an orange cake, of simmering tomato sauce, or on a rainy afternoon, of hot chocolate. The smells hit him at the door, unwanted portals to a past he had sealed away. He remembered Sarah, his wife, laughing in the kitchen covered in flour. The memory was a sharp knife, and his immediate reaction was irritation. Who did Margot think she was to desecrate his sanctuary of grief with the smells of happiness? He walked into the kitchen one evening, ready to reprimand her for deviating from the meal plan, but he stopped. The scene disarmed him. Margot was sitting at the table with the girls, teaching them how to make a paper boat. The table was clean, the dinner dishes put away, the schedule followed. This was extra, an unsolicited surplus. He watched, hidden in the shadows of the hallway. He saw the concentration on Emma's face, the way Sophie laughed when her boat capsized. He saw Margot, patient and present. She was not performing a task. She was sharing a moment. Julian's annoyance grew and turned into a kind of resentment. She did her job perfectly, and then she went beyond. He found a button she had sewn back onto Sophie's shirt. He saw a library book she had covered in plastic to protect it. He noticed she had fixed the squeak in the girl's bedroom door. Every small act of care was another stone added to a growing wall between him and his daughters. And the worst part was that she asked for nothing. Her salary was deposited into her account, and she never mentioned money, days off, or recognition. She simply gave. This generosity was an imbalance in his worldview. He did not know how to handle a transaction that was one-sided. He felt indebted, and there was no way to repay that debt. The girls, oblivious to their father's turmoil, were beginning to flourish in this atmosphere of quiet care. They were like thirsty plants finally finding water. The first to extend a branch was Sophie. She was the observer, the silent artist. She spent an entire afternoon drawing. Then, with her heart pounding, she approached Margot, who was reading in the small back patio during her break. Sophie held out the paper, her face serious. Margot took it with a gentleness that honored the girl's effort. The drawing showed 4 stick figures holding hands under a radiant sun. 2 were small and blonde. 1 was tall and scowling, and the 4th, next to the girls, had brown hair and a smile that took up half her face. "Is this me?" Margot asked, her voice thick with emotion. Sophie nodded, a blush rising on her cheeks. Margot did not say it was beautiful. She said something better. "You know, I think this is the most honest family portrait I've ever seen." She looked at Sophie. "Thank you. I will keep it forever." Later, Julian saw the drawing, held by a magnet on the door of the metal locker in Margot's room. A splash of color and affection in a world of beige and gray. Emma's turn came a few mornings later. Her fine blonde hair was a constant source of battle. Julian, always in a hurry, would try to detangle it with impatient tugs, causing more tears than order. That morning, the knots seemed worse than ever. "Stay still, Emma," he ordered as she squirmed. It's just hair." "You're hurting me," she whimpered, her eyes filling with frustrated tears. At that moment, Margot entered the room to get the school backpacks. She saw the scene and stopped, saying nothing so as not to undermine his authority. But Emma saw her. In her eyes, there was a silent plea. In a decision that shocked Julian, Emma snatched the brush from his hand, got off the chair and walked to Margot. She held out the brush to her. It was not a request. It was a surrender. Julian stood frozen, the phantom brush in his hand. He watched as Margot knelt, bringing herself to Emma's level. "Turn around, sweetie," she said softly. With a firm but gentle hand on Emma's shoulder, Margot began to work. Her fingers were magical, finding the knots and persuading them to release, rather than yanking them out. She hummed quietly, a sound that vibrated through her hands to the girl's scalp. In a few minutes, Emma's hair was smooth, shiny, and tied back with a perfect ribbon, and Emma had not shed a single tear. On the contrary, she looked calm. Julian left the room without a word. He did not just feel excluded. He felt incompetent. There were multi-million-dollar problems he could solve with a phone call, but he could not comb his own daughter's hair. That was the turning point. The girls were no longer just observers. They became satellites, orbiting Margot's warmth. They followed her, a pair of blonde shadows, to the laundry room, to the garden, to the kitchen. They brought her treasures. A ladybug in their palm, a funny-shaped stone, a flower plucked from a flower bed. They shared with her the tiny secrets of their days. Julian would come home to find them huddled on the sofa, not watching television, but listening to Margot tell a story, using only her voice and her hands to create entire worlds. He would enter, and a veil would fall. The voices would lower, the smiles would hesitate. He was the king returning to his castle, only to find that his people had found a new leader. His irritation fermented into anger. He needed to reassert his control, to put this woman back in her place. He found her in the kitchen late one night, after the girls were asleep. The house was quiet again, but it was a different silence now, filled with the echoes of the day's laughter and whispers. "We need to talk," he said, his voice sharp. Margot turned, her face serene under the cool kitchen light. "You are overstepping your duties," he began, getting straight to the point. "Your influence over them is becoming excessive. They are impressionable children. They get attached too easily. I hired you for a task, not to infiltrate my family. I want you to maintain a professional distance. Do not get too close." The order hung in the air. It was his attempt to build a wall, to separate work from feeling, to put affection back in its box and lock it away. Margot listened to him in silence, absorbing every word. She did not seem offended or intimidated. Her gaze was steady, full of a sad understanding that infuriated him even more. When she answered, her voice was not defiant, but it carried the weight of a fundamental truth. "They don't want perfection, Mr. Wexler," she said, each word chosen with care. "The house is perfect. The clothes are perfect. The schedule is perfect." She paused, and her gaze met his. "They just want someone who will stay." The sentence hit him not like a punch, but like the strike of a tuning fork, vibrating at a frequency he had spent years trying to ignore. The naked truth. He was the master of leaving. The father who was always on his way to the door, to the phone, to the next deal. He gave them everything, except himself. Margot, who had nothing, gave them the one thing he could not: her constant, unwavering, and unconditional presence. He stood there, disarmed, with no defense against that simple, devastating logic. There was nothing he could say. He was a billionaire who had just been informed of his total bankruptcy. Without another word, Julian turned and left, leaving Margot alone in the kitchen. He went up to his office, his refuge, and sat in the darkness, surrounded by all the trophies and symbols of his success. For the first time in a long time, he felt completely poor. He was losing a war he did not even know he was fighting, for control of a territory he had never bothered to occupy. Margot's words, "They just want someone who will stay," had lodged in Julian's mind like a splinter. He could not remove them. During the week that followed their kitchen conversation, he began to watch. From his office, through half-open doors, He saw the small rituals that now made up his daughters' days. He saw Margot teaching them to tie their shoes, not with his impatience, but with a methodical calm. He heard them laughing as they tried to bake misshapen cookies. He saw a level of interaction that he, all in his quest to give them a perfect world, had never even tried to provide. He no longer felt just irritated, he felt irrelevant. The change in the house's dynamic was undeniable. The atmosphere, once charged with a cold formality, now had pockets of warmth that invariably formed around Margot. It was on one of those evenings, after dinner, that she made the proposal that would further shake the foundations of Julian's world. The girls would normally be dismissed to their rooms after the meal for a supervised quiet time before bed. But that night, Margot intervened, addressing Julian with a respect that did not mask the firmness of her intention. "Mr. Wexler, I was thinking," she began, her voice calm. "Emma and Sophie have such vivid imaginations, and there are so many wonderful worlds in books. Maybe we could start reading them a story every night before they sleep. Just one chapter. Together." The word together hung in the air, laden with meaning. It was not a suggestion for her to read to the girls. It was an invitation, a bridge offered across the chasm that separated him from his daughters. Julian's first reaction was a sharp, immediate mental no. It was a waste of time. The schedule said that at 7:30 p.m. they should be getting ready for bed, not starting a new activity. Reading was inefficient, sentimental. And above all, it would be another moment where he would have to navigate the uncomfortable territory of family intimacy that he avoided at all costs. He was about to refuse, to make an excuse about work, when he looked at his daughters. They had heard Margot's proposal, and their faces, usually so passive, were lit with a palpable hope. Emma's and Sophie's blue eyes were fixed on him, expectant. In their gaze, he saw not a request for a story, but a plea for his presence. To refuse would be like confirming Margot's accusation out loud. It would be admitting, in front of them, that he was the father who did not stay. With a sigh that barely disguised his impatience, he relented. "Fine," he said. His voice clipped. "One chapter, 10 minutes, no more." The joy on the girls' faces was so instant and pure that it surprised him. They did not seem to notice his reluctance. They only celebrated his surrender. Margot went to the bookshelf and returned with a book with an old illustrated cover. It was a classic, a story about children who discover a passage to a magical land inside a wardrobe. The choice seemed fitting for this house, where magic was desperately trying to find a crack to get in. They gathered in the living room, a room so rarely used for leisure it looked like a set. Instinctively, Margot and the girls settled onto the large, soft sofa. Sophie on one side of Margot, Emma on the other. Julian, out of habit and a need to maintain distance, sat in a separate leather armchair, facing them, an island of rigidity in an ocean of anticipation. "Would you like to start?" Margot asked, holding the book out to him. He took the book as if it were a hostile quarterly report. He cleared his throat and began to read. His voice was the same one he used in conference calls, a monotone of words, fast, without inflection, and focused only on reaching the end. He did not do voices for the characters. He read dialogue and narration in the same flat tone. He mispronounced one of the characters' names and Lucy, and did not correct himself even when Emma giggled. He read badly, terribly badly. The narrative, which should have been full of mystery and wonder, sounded like the reading of a grocery list. He felt like an idiot, uncomfortable and exposed. He expected the girls to get bored, to start fidgeting, giving him the perfect excuse to end this charade. But the opposite happened. They were fascinated. Emma laughed openly when he stumbled over the name of a faun, and Sophie let out a restrained giggle. It was not a laugh of mockery, it was a laugh of pure joy. They were not laughing at him, they were laughing with him. His mere presence there, participating in this ritual, reading a book to them, no matter how poorly he did it, was an event so extraordinary and wonderful that the quality of the reading was irrelevant. He was there, he had stayed, and that was everything. Julian faltered, their laughter disconcerting him. He had expected boredom, maybe even a childish critique. He did not expect joy. It did not fit his logic. He was performing the task poorly, yet the result was positive. The equation did not make sense. He continued to read, his voice perhaps a little slower, the confusion growing inside him. 1. And then it happened. As the story deepened, and the main character entered the snowy world of the wardrobe, Sophie, absorbed and seeking comfort, rested her head on Margot's shoulder. It was a natural, instinctive movement. Margot, without taking her eyes off the book in Julian's hands, wrapped her arm around Sophie's small shoulders, pulling her closer. A few seconds later, Emma, who always maintained a reserve and a small protective distance, looked at her nested sister and, with an almost inaudible sigh, mirrored the gesture. She rested her head on the other side, on Margot's other shoulder. Margot's free arm wrapped around Emma too. The scene formed before Julian's eyes like a photograph slowly developing in a dark room. In the center of the sofa was Margot, the axis of warmth and security. On each side, nestled against her, were his daughters, Emma and Sophie, their blonde hair contrasting with her dark sweater. They formed a small, perfect triangle of belonging, a family. Julian stopped reading. The word got stuck in his throat. He looked at the scene, and the feeling that washed over him was not the cold anger or irritation he had felt before. It was something deeper, heavier, a dull ache that started in his chest and spread throughout his body. He was on the outside. He was less than 10 feet away, but he might as well have been on another continent. He was in his leather armchair, a solitary spectator, watching the most intimate scene his house had ever hosted, and he was not a part of it. He was a stranger looking through the window of his own life. He saw the empty space next to Emma on the sofa, a space that was his by right, a space he could have occupied, but he had chosen the armchair, the distance, the separation. He looked at Margot, who had done nothing to steal his place. She had simply filled the vacuum he had created. She had not gotten too close. He was the one who had stayed too far away. The pain he felt was not just of exclusion, it was the sharp pain of self-awareness. For the first time, he did not blame Margot for building this bond with his daughters. He wondered why he himself had never done it. He gave them houses, clothes, schools, security. He gave them everything money could buy. But he had never given them that simple, priceless gift, a safe shoulder on which they could rest their heads. He realized with devastating clarity that he was on the outside, and that the door had not been closed on him. He was the one who had never tried to open it. Guilt, a feeling he rarely allowed himself, began to surface. Maybe this was all his fault. He cleared his throat, which felt tight, and forced himself to continue reading. The last sentences of the chapter came out almost as a whisper, the words losing all meaning. He was just making sounds to fill the heavy silence in his own mind. When he finished, he closed the book with a soft click. "That's it." "Already?" asked Sophie, her voice sleepy, her face still nestled against Margot. "More tomorrow," Margot said softly, kissing the top of her head and then Emma's. Julian stood up. "Good night," he said formally to the sofa. "Good night, Daddy," the girls murmured in unison without moving. He turned and walked out of the living room, leaving that circle of light and warmth behind. He retreated to the familiar solitude of his office. He sat in his leather chair, the same one that gave him so much power during the day, and felt completely helpless. The silence of the room, which once brought him peace and focus, now felt like a punishment, an echo of his own isolation. He was the father who did not know how to be a father, and for the first time, the pain of that realization was greater than the pride that kept him from learning. The pain of that night in the living room did not leave him. Instead, it settled in his chest like a constant presence, a cold reminder of his own exile. For the first time, Julian Wexler, a man who bent financial markets to his will, felt completely powerless. He had built an empire, but did not know how to build a bridge across the 10 feet of carpet that separated him from his daughters. On Saturday morning, he woke up with an uncomfortable and unfamiliar resolution. It was not a business strategy, but a raw, clumsy impulse. He had to do something. He had to try. He came downstairs earlier than usual. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows, illuminating the scene that had become familiar. Margot, already up, moving with a calm efficiency, and the girls sitting at the table, still sleepy. The smell of fresh coffee hung in the air. Margot was about to grab a bowl to mix pancake batter, a Saturday tradition she had established. "I'll do it." The three of them turned to him, surprised. Julian's voice sounded harsher than he intended, almost like a challenge. He stood at the kitchen entrance, uncomfortable in his own weekend clothes, which felt more like a costume. "Pancakes. I can do it." Margot watched him for a moment, and in her gaze there was no surprise, but a deep understanding. She saw the effort, the clumsy attempt of a proud man asking for help without knowing the words. Without hesitation, she dried her hands on a towel and stepped aside, ceding him the space. "Of course, Mr. Wexler. They'll love that." The girls looked at each other, a mixture of astonishment and curiosity on their faces. Daddy in the kitchen, making pancakes. It was as unlikely as seeing a fish ride a bicycle. Julian rolled up his sleeves with a confidence that lasted approximately 30 seconds. He, the master of complex equations and profit projections, looked at the recipe as if it were written in an ancient language. Flour, baking powder, eggs, measurements. This was chemistry, a field of unstable variables. He was a man of certainties. With a blind determination, he began to mix the ingredients. He added too much salt, forgot the sugar. The batter was lumpy, a pale and unpromising mixture. He heated the pan on the highest setting, operating on the logic that more heat would speed up the process. The result was immediate and disastrous. The first pancake hit the pan and turned into a black wide, smoking disc in less than a minute. The smoke rose, thick and acrid, and the fire alarm went off with a shrill scream that made everyone jump. "Dad!" Emma shouted, covering her ears. Frustrated, Julian snatched the pan from the stove and threw the carbonized offense into the sink. He tried again. This time, he lowered the heat, but the poorly mixed batter spread unevenly. The result was a pale aberration, burnt on the outside and raw on the inside. He cursed under his breath, his face red with humiliation. The great Julian Wexler, defeated by breakfast. The girls, who had been watching everything in apprehensive silence, could not take it anymore. The sight of their all-powerful, immaculate father brandishing a spatula at a misshapen pancake while the fire alarm still blared was too much. Sophie let out a little, stifled giggle. Emma looked at her, tried to hold it in, but a bubbly laugh escaped too. In seconds, they were both roaring with laughter, a pure, genuine and contagious laugh that filled the silent kitchen. Julian's first reaction was a wave of fury and shame. They were laughing at his failure, but then he really heard the sound. It was not a sound he heard often. It was the sound of unrestrained joy. He looked at their flushed faces, their eyes shining with tears from laughing so hard, and the absurdity of the situation hit him. Here he was, in his million-dollar kitchen, fighting a losing war against breakfast. A smile twitched at the corner of his mouth, a muscle spasm he barely recognized. Then, a hoarse, rusty sound escaped his throat. A laugh. At first, awkward, but then, fueled by their laughter, it became real. He laughed. He laughed at the fire alarm, at the smoke, at the pathetic pancake in the pan, and above all, at himself. For the first time in years, Julian Wexler laughed until his stomach hurt. In that moment, amidst the smoke and failure, he was not a billionaire. He was just a dad burning breakfast, laughing with his daughters, and the feeling was like taking a breath after being underwater for a long time. That culinary disaster opened a small crack in his armor, and in the days that followed, Julian began, hesitantly and clumsily, to try to slip through it. He started making choices. One afternoon, he found the girls and Margot on the living room floor, surrounded by pots of colored Play-Doh. In the past, he would have walked straight to his office. This time, he stopped. After a moment of hesitation, he sat on the floor with them. The act of sitting on the expensive rug, on his knees, felt like a surrender. "What are we building?" he asked. "A zoo," said Emma, showing him a misshapen purple snake. Julian's, in his problem-solving mode, tried to create a geometrically perfect cage. But then he saw Sophie making a blue elephant with 3 trunks. He smiled, and instead of correcting her, he made a green monster with 5 eyes. The girls loved it. He was no longer trying to be perfect, he was just playing. During the nightly reading sessions, he asked for the book. His reading was still stiff, but he tried. He made a deep voice for a giant and a high-pitched voice for a fairy. His attempts were cartoonish and bad, but the effort was everything. Emma and Sophie laughed, not in a mocking way, but with affection. They would cuddle on the sofa, but now their eyes would alternate between Margot and him. He was slowly entering the circle of light. He started asking questions, no longer the generic interrogation of "how was school?" but questions that showed he was paying attention. "Sophie, I saw your drawing of a tree on the fridge. Was that for art class?" Or Emma, "Margot told me you learned to write your name today. Can you show me?" And when they answered, excited by his attention, he listened. He really listened. The biggest test came on a Tuesday afternoon. He was in the middle of a game of hide-and-seek in the garden, another unthinkable activity weeks before, when his phone vibrated. It was his stockbroker, an urgent notification about a stock that was plummeting. The old Julian would have answered the call in an instant, the adrenaline of the market overriding everything. But this time, he looked at the vibrating phone in his hand, and then at the faces of his daughters, who were peeking at him from behind a bush, their giggles suppressed. He felt the weight of the 2 realities, of the 2 worlds pulling at him. And then, with a deliberate movement, he silenced the phone and put it in his pocket, face down. He chose hide-and-seek. He chose his daughters. In that moment, the potential loss of millions of dollars seemed insignificant compared to the richness of that sound of laughter in the garden. He was starting to enjoy being present. He discovered a satisfaction in completing a puzzle that no successful negotiation had ever given him. He felt genuinely useful when he managed to fix the wheel of a small toy truck. And when Sophie, after he told a particularly silly bedtime story, spontaneously hugged him and said, "Good night, Daddy," he felt cherished in a way that left him breathless. These were simple, primary feelings he had filed away long ago, classifying them as weaknesses or distractions. But now, by allowing them, he felt more himself than he had in years. He felt human. That night, after putting the girls to bed, a task he now shared with Margot, he stood in the silent hallway. The transformation was not happening because of some grand event. It was happening in the small moments, in the smoke from the pancakes, in a Play-Doh monster, in an ignored phone call. He was learning that love was not just a duty to be fulfilled with checks and security. It was not a passive feeling that happened to you. It was a verb. It was an action. It was a choice. It was the choice to sit on the floor, the choice to laugh at himself, the choice to turn off the world and stay. And he, for the first time, was starting to choose to love. The transformation was beginning from within, silent and powerful. Julian's transformation was not a straight path. There were days when the impatience returned, when the habit of taking refuge in work screamed louder. But now there was a counterforce, the memory of a laugh, the feel of a small hand in his, the sound of his name being called with joy, not formality. He was relearning how to live in his own house, how to navigate the corridors not as a CEO inspecting a property, but as a father finding his way back. The most visible result of his change was in his daughters. The house, once a sanctuary of silence, now breathed with the sounds of childhood. Toys were left scattered in the living room for more than 5 minutes. There were paint stains on the kitchen table. There was life. On a lazy Sunday afternoon, a light rain tapped against the windows, enveloping the house in a cozy atmosphere. Margot was in the kitchen, preparing a snack, and Julian was in his office, with the door deliberately left open. On the plush living room carpet, Emma and Sophie were lying on their stomachs. A pile of paper and a rainbow of colored pencils spread around them. They were drawing in a comfortable silence, the only sound being the soft scratching of pencils on paper. Julian watched them from a distance. The scene was so simple, so normal, and yet, to him, it felt like a miracle. Months before, they would have each been in a corner with a tablet, existing in separate worlds. Now, they shared the same space, the same activity, the same peace. It was Sophie who broke the silence, her voice soft and thoughtful, as if she were giving voice to a thought that had been living in her mind for a long time. "I wish Margot could be our real mum." The sentence, spoken without drama, with the brutal honesty of a child, floated through the air and reached Julian's office door. He froze, his hand hovering over the keyboard. Emma, without looking up from her drawing of a cat with wings, replied with the same naturalness. "She already takes care of us like one." It was not a discussion, it was a statement of fact. For them, the logic was simple. A mother was someone who cared for you. A mother was someone who kissed your scraped knee, who told stories with funny voices, who baked cookies on rainy days. A mother was someone who stayed, and Margot stayed. Hidden in the dimness of his office, Julian felt the words hit him with a force that left him breathless. He shrank in his chair, invisible to them, feeling a lump form in his throat. It was not pain, not jealousy, not anger. It was a complex and overwhelming emotion, a deep sadness for his failure to have been enough for them, mixed with a gratitude for Margot so immense it hurt. They were not rejecting the memory of Sarah, the mother they had lost so young. They were just naming what they lacked, the hole that had been left in their small lives. And they were acknowledging the person who, with a quiet generosity, had begun to fill it. Tears burned in his eyes, a sensation so rare he barely recognized it. He did not let them fall. He just sat there in silence, listening to the sound of his daughters, pencils on paper, feeling the weight and truth of their words. They had verbalized Julian with crushing simplicity, the feeling that had been growing in his own heart, a feeling he had not yet had the courage to admit to himself. He did not move until he heard Margot call them for a snack, and the sound of little feet running toward the kitchen. He needed a moment to compose himself, to absorb the revelation. Later that night, when the house was quiet and the girls were asleep, Julian found Margot in the living room. She was folding the blanket they had used earlier, fluffing the pillows, restoring order with her calm gestures. He had spent the last few hours thinking, not about business or strategies, but about feelings, and he knew he could no longer remain silent. "Margot," he said, his voice softer than usual. She turned, a small smile on her face. "Leave that," he continued, gesturing to the blanket. I made some tea, if you'd like." The offer made him vulnerable. It was the first time he had invited her to do something that was not work-related. It was a peace offering, an invitation to neutral territory. She nodded, and they sat in the kitchen, the same place where he had confronted her weeks before. But the atmosphere was completely different. Julian placed 2 steaming mugs on the table. The silence between them was no longer tense, but contemplative. He looked down at his own hands, wrapped around the warm mug, searching for the right words. "I heard the girls this afternoon," he began, the confession coming out with difficulty, "talking in the living room." He lifted his eyes to meet hers. "You—" He stopped, took a deep breath, and tried again. "You brought life back to this house. I didn't think that was possible." It was the most vulnerability he could express. It was an admission that the house had been dead before her, that he had been dead. It was a thank you and an apology, all in one sentence. Margot did not seem surprised. She just listened, her gaze full of a serene empathy. She picked up her mug, the warmth spreading through her hands. "Sometimes," she replied, her voice low and reflective, "you find your place when you've already stopped looking." Her words were a balm. She was not just talking about herself, a woman who had lost everything and found an unexpected purpose in this house. She was talking about him, too, a man who had stopped looking for happiness, who had settled for merely existing, and who now, unintentionally, was finding his place again, not at the top of an empire, but at his kitchen table with a cup of tea. They sat in silence, drinking their tea. But in that silence, a new foundation was laid. The girls had planted a seed with their innocent wish. And now in that quiet kitchen, Julian and Margot, 2 strangers who had stopped looking, were beginning to feel that maybe they had found something together. The conversation in the kitchen, with the mugs of tea between them, had created a crack in the wall of formality that separated Julian and Margot. In the days that followed, Mr. Wexler gave way to a hesitant Julian, and the dynamic between them shifted from employer and employee to something closer to a partnership. They moved through the house with a mutual awareness, a silent dance of people sharing a common purpose, the happiness of Emma and Sophie. But beneath this new harmony, Julian felt the weight of everything that was still unsaid. His gratitude was immense, but the words to express it were trapped under layers of pride and old pain. It was on a late autumn afternoon, a few days later, that he finally found the courage he needed. The workday had been cut short by his own choice, a decision that was becoming more and more frequent. The girls, after a lively snack, were in their room, immersed in a building game Margot had taught them. The house was steeped in a peaceful quiet. The sky outside was a painting of orange, pink, and violet hues. Twilight, the time of day that is neither day nor night, a time of transition and reflection. Julian found Margot on the back porch, watching the colors deepen on the horizon. She was wrapped in a shawl, a figure of serenity amidst the fleeting beauty of the dusk. He approached in silence and sat in the chair next to her. For several minutes, they said nothing. They just shared the silence, watching the day die. Before, that silence would have been awkward, a void to be filled. Now it was comfortable, a safe space. It was in this space that Julian knew he needed to speak. He cleared his throat, the sound oddly loud in the quiet. Margot turned her face to him, her eyes patient, waiting. "I haven't," he began, his voice hoarse, the words difficult to form. He looked at his own hands, clasped tightly in his lap. "I've never talked about this with anyone." He took a deep breath, the cool evening air filling his lungs. "When I lost my wife, when Sarah was gone, it was like the light in the world was turned off, and the silence in this house was deafening." He paused, the memory still vivid, still painful. "I didn't know what to do with it, or with them. They were so small, a constant reminder of what I had lost." The confession hung in the air. It was the first time he had admitted the depth of his own pain. "So I did the only thing I knew how to do," he continued, his voice low, almost a whisper. "I worked. I buried myself in work so I wouldn't feel. I traveled, held late-night meetings, filled every second of my day with numbers and problems I could solve, because the pain was a problem I had no solution for." He raised his eyes and looked at the horizon, but he did not see it. He saw the past, the years of absence. "I convinced myself I was doing the right thing, that I was building a future for them. I thought giving them things would be enough. The best house, the best schools, the best toys." He shook his head, a gesture of self-deprecation. "But I failed them, and myself." His voice broke on the last sentence. The admission of his failure, spoken aloud, was like a blade. He, the man who never failed, who built an empire on a foundation of infallible success, was finally facing his greatest and most devastating defeat. Margot listened. She offered no words of comfort, did not say, "You did what you could," or any other empty cliché. She simply witnessed his pain, offering him the dignity of being heard without interruption, without judgment. Her silence was a form of respect, a space where his truth could exist without being diminished. Feeling the tremor in his hand, which was now resting on the arm of the chair, she did the only thing that mattered. Slowly, she reached out and covered his hand with hers. It was not a gesture of pity, but of solidarity. A simple, cold, warm touch that said, "I am here. I understand. You are not alone." The physical contact anchored him. His strength, which he had used for so long to keep the world at bay, finally gave way. He allowed himself to feel the weight of that touch, of that silent acceptance. After a long moment, he turned to her, his eyes shining with a vulnerability that transformed him. "I didn't know how to be present," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I saw the girls as appointments, tasks. I didn't see the sadness in their eyes until you came." He swallowed hard. "You taught me how to be here. I didn't know how. Thank you." Those two words, "thank you," carried the weight of years of loneliness, of regret, and of a newfound gratitude. It was not just a thank you for taking care of his daughters. It was a thank you for showing him the way back home, to them, and to himself. By allowing himself to be vulnerable, by admitting his failure and his pain, Julian did not break. On the contrary, he became whole for the first time in a long time. The confession on that twilight porch changed everything. The truth, once spoken, cleared the air, dissolving the last barriers of formality between them. What followed was not an abrupt change, but a natural settling into the new reality they had created together. The house exuded a different energy, a lightness born from honesty. A few days later, Emma ran to them as they were talking in the kitchen while preparing dinner. She held a piece of paper with a radiant pride on her face. "I made a drawing for us." She held out the paper. On it, 4 stick figures smiled under a bright yellow sun. A tall man, a woman with wavy hair, and 2 identical girls between them, all holding hands. Above them, in crooked, colorful letters, she had written a sentence. "We are a team," she read aloud. Julian crouched down, took the drawing, and looked at his daughter's smiling face. Then he looked at Margot, who was watching the scene with teary eyes. A team. It was the perfect definition. He hugged Emma tightly. "Yes, we are, sweetie. The best team in the world." Their life found a new rhythm, a routine built not on a rigid schedule, but on sharing and collaboration. The mornings were no longer a chaotic race against the clock. They became a choreographed dance. Julian, who now prided himself on his rarely burnt pancakes, manned the stove. Margot, beside him, packed the lunchboxes, checking that homework was in the backpacks. They moved in sync, exchanging glances and smiles over the girls, blonde heads, who now chatted about their dreams and plans for the school day. Laughter became the soundtrack of their mornings. Julian started coming home earlier, not out of obligation but out of desire. He traded his smartphone for the living room floor, his market reports for puzzles. He discovered that the logic needed to find the right puzzle piece was, in a way, more satisfying than closing a deal. He listened, he asked questions, he participated. One evening, after a particularly happy day that involved a tickle fight and an impromptu movie session on the sofa with popcorn scattered everywhere, Julian and Margot were tidying up the living room. The girls were already asleep, their faces serene and smiling. The house was quiet, but it was a full silence, filled with the memories of the day. Julian picked up a cushion from the floor and placed it on the sofa. He looked at Margot, who was folding a blanket, and a feeling of deep peace and contentment washed over him. Everything felt right, in its place. "I think we've become a family," he said, his voice low and full of a quiet wonder. It was not a question, but an observation, a truth he finally allowed himself to acknowledge. Margot stopped what she was doing. A soft smile lit up her face. She looked at him, at the room that was now a home, and her answer was the final piece of the puzzle, the truth that united them all. "I think we already were. They already were." Their family forged not by blood or contract, but by choice, by care, and by the courage to fill each other's empty spaces, without labels, without formalities, just the truth of 4 people who, together, had found their place. The Wexler house had found a new rhythm, a steady beat of warmth and life that once seemed impossible. Julian, stripped of his old rigidity, had discovered a new version of himself on the living room floor. Among puzzle pieces and Play-Doh monsters, Margot, in turn, had gone from being a silent presence to the axis around which the family revolved. The change was visible in the girls' easy smiles, in the lightness of the air, in the way silence now meant peace, not emptiness. That Saturday did not begin with any promise of being a momentous day. It was just a lazy, sunny day with a cloudless blue sky. At Julian's suggestion, they went to the park, the same stage of the encounter that changed their lives. But this time, the scene was different. Julian did not have a phone in his hand. He had a daughter's hand in each of his. He pushed them on the swings, not out of obligation, but for the sheer joy of hearing their laughter. He and Margot exchanged glances over the girls' heads, glances that held volumes of shared understanding and affection. They were a unit, a team. Back at home, a sense of contentment hung over them. While Julian and Margot talked in the kitchen, Emma and Sophie exchanged a secret, purposeful look. They disappeared into their room, closing the door with an air of conspiracy. Muffled giggles and whispers leaked from under the door, but the adults, smiling, decided not to interrupt whatever their game was. A short time later, they emerged. Their faces were serious, their hands held. Emma was holding a brown paper envelope, clearly homemade, decorated with star stickers. They marched to the living room, where Julian and Margot were sitting on the sofa, and stood before them like a small delegation with an announcement to make. "This is for you," Emma said, her voice a little shaky with nerves and importance, holding the envelope out to Margot. Surprised, Margot took the envelope. Her eyes met Julian's for a second before she turned her attention back to the girls. With careful hands, she opened the flap and pulled out a folded sheet of drawing paper. Unfolding it, revealed a child's letter. At the top of the page, a drawing of the four of them smiled, holding hands under a huge, happy sun. Margot began to read aloud, her soft voice filling the quiet room. "Dear Margot." The emotion hit her at the simple address. She continued, her voice gaining a shaky tone. "You taught us to see animal shapes in the clouds. You read stories with funny voices. You hug us when we're scared of the dark. You make our daddy laugh for real." Each sentence was a testament, an acknowledgement of the small, daily miracles she had brought to that house. Tears began to well up in Margot's eyes, blurring the colorful letters. At the end of the letter, a single question stood out, written in larger letters, as if shouting the deepest desire of their hearts. Margot read the final sentence in a whisper that could barely be heard. "Mommy Margot, will you stay with us forever?" The word mommy landed in the silence of the room with the weight and lightness of a feather. It was the confession of a need, the naming of a love that already existed. Margot brought a hand to her mouth, a silent sob shaking her shoulders. She looked at the girls, at those faces full of a hope so pure and overwhelming, and felt unable to speak. Julian felt the impact of those words in his own chest. He saw his daughters, who had had the courage to ask for what he himself longed for but dared not name. He saw Margot, the woman he had taken in for convenience and now loved completely, crying with emotion. In that instant, any remnant of fear or hesitation that might still have inhabited his heart vanished. The girls had shown him the way. He moved, putting a comforting arm around Margot before looking directly at her. His voice, when he spoke, was the most honest and vulnerable it had ever been. "You're already a part of this," he said softly, his gaze taking in everything around them. The girls, the house, the life they had built, a life. He paused, ensuring his next words were not an assumption but an invitation. "If you want to, we can be a family. For real." It was his own question, echoing theirs. An offer not of a back room or a job, but of a permanent place in his heart and his life. A request for their team to become official, sealed not by a contract, but by a promise. Margot lifted her tear-streaked face. She looked at Julian, the man who had learned to feel, and then at Emma and Sophie, the girls who had given her back a purpose. She had arrived here with nothing, hoping only for a chance. And now, she was being given everything. Love, belonging, a home. A shaky, radiant smile blossomed on her lips. Her answer was the same promise she had made to Julian on that first day in the park, a vow that now found its true and eternal meaning. "With all my heart." The words had barely left her mouth when Emma and Sophie, with cries of pure joy, launched themselves into a tight hug, nearly knocking her over on the sofa. Julian joined them, wrapping his arms around them all, forming a closed circle. There were no more lines separating them. They were just four people, united by past losses and, now, by a present and chosen love. They were a family, for real. 6 months passed, marking the transition not only of the seasons of the year, but of the seasons of the soul. The harsh winter had given way to a timid spring that was blooming in the mansion's gardens, but inside the house, spring had been in full, exuberant bloom for a long time. The walls, which were once witnesses to a frigid silence and impeccable order, now bore the marks of a happy life. Small fingerprints on the glass, a scratch here and there from a toy driven with too much enthusiasm, and, above all, the vibrant energy of a family. Saturday morning was living proof of this transformation. The kitchen, once a rarely disturbed stainless steel laboratory, became a stage of delightful chaos. Julian, wearing an apron that already told many stories of culinary battles, presided over the pancake ceremony. Beside him, perched on high stools, Emma and Sophie were his dedicated and clumsy assistants. "Daddy, my turn to crack the egg," Sophie announced, grabbing one with more enthusiasm than care. The result was a mix of yolk, white, and shell pieces in the bowl. The old Julian would have tensed up, impatience bubbling. He would have scolded, sighed, taken the bowl from her, and done it all himself with an irritated efficiency. But the new Julian simply laughed. "Oops. Looks like we're having crunchy pancakes today," he joked. With the tip of a spoon, he showed Sophie how to fish out the pieces of shell. "See, it's like a game. We have to rescue the treasure." He turned the mistake into a game, frustration into a lesson in patience. The girls giggled, their hands dirty with flour, their faces lit by a priceless joy. Margot watched the scene from the kitchen table, a cup of coffee warming her hands. Her heart filled at the sight. Julian, the man she had known as a fortress of pain and control, now completely at ease in the messiness of love. Their gazes met over the girls' blonde heads, and in that silent look there was an entire dialogue of complicity, love, and gratitude. Margot's life had also blossomed. Julian had encouraged her not to abandon her passion. "The girls have me. They have us," he had said. "But the world deserves to have you too." With his support, she had accepted a part-time position as a literature teacher at a nearby school. She was back in her element, surrounded by books and the curiosity of children. In the evenings, she would bring home funny stories about her students, and the family would gather to listen. Her identity was no longer defined by loss, nor solely by her role in that house. She was Margot, the teacher, the partner, the mother. Her happiness was complete, for it was born not of necessity, but of choice. The house breathed this new fullness. Where a silence once reigned so heavily it felt like a physical presence, there was now the constant sound of little feet running, of music playing, of a story being read aloud, and above all, the sound of laughter. An easy and frequent laughter that seemed to have the power to clean every dark corner. Where the air once had the sterile, chemical smell of cleaning products, there was now the smell of fresh coffee in the morning, of Margot's chocolate cake in the afternoon, of the scent of wet grass coming through the open window, and of the crayons and paper that were a constant in the living room. Where everything was once untouchable, now everything invited touch. There was always a soft blanket on the sofa, a pile of books with pages worn from use, a still warm mug of tea on the coffee table. Touch was the family's new language, a spontaneous hug from one of the girls, Julian's hand seeking Margot's while watching a movie, a stroke of the hair, a goodnight kiss. The house was finally a place to be lived in, not just inhabited. That Saturday afternoon after the pancake adventure, a cozy calm settled in. Julian was on the rug, helping the girls finish a puzzle. Suddenly, Emma stood up, a determined glint in her eyes. She ran to the kitchen, grabbed a drawing that was on the counter, and came back, stopping in front of the refrigerator. The fridge door, once a cold and empty surface of brushed steel, had become the beating heart of the house, a chaotic and colorful mural of his daughter's imagination. Drawings of smiling suns, cats with wings, and stick-figure family portraits covered almost every inch. Emma found a small space and, with utmost concentration, pinned her new work of art with a ladybug-shaped magnet. She stepped back, admired her work, and called out, "Daddy, come see, I made a new one." Julian got up, curiosity on his face. Margot came over too, standing beside him. The drawing was simple, but its meaning was immense. It showed a tall man, with a grin from ear to ear, holding a spatula over a pan. Two small girls were hugging his legs, but it was the caption, written in proud, capital letters, that took Julian's breath away. He crouched down, getting on Emma's level, and read the words aloud. His voice broke, thick with an emotion he was no longer afraid to feel. "Now we have a real dad, a real dad." The phrase echoed in his mind, knocking down the last ghosts of his past. He remembered the man he used to be, the father who came home late, who gave orders instead of hugs, who saw his daughters as just another item on his long list of responsibilities. That man was not a real dad. He was a shadow, a bank account, a distant authority. The tears that filled his eyes were not of sadness, but of overwhelming gratitude. He looked at Emma, at Sophie who had come closer, and then at Margot. On that simple piece of paper was the proof of his redemption. It was the most valuable prize he had ever received in his entire life. He said nothing. He just opened his arms and pulled his two daughters into the tightest hug he had ever given them. He buried his face in their hair, his heart overflowing. He felt Margot's hand on his back, closing the circle, uniting them. When he finally let them go, he kept his eyes on the drawing. He finally understood. His greatest legacy would not be the empire he built, the buildings that bore his name, or the fortune he would leave behind. His greatest legacy was this messy, flour-dusted kitchen, the laughter echoing through the house, and that small piece of paper held up by a ladybug magnet. The impatient father had transformed into the man who stayed, the man who learned that love was not an obligation but a daily choice, the choice to be present, to be vulnerable, to laugh at his own failure. And it was this choice, so simple and so profound, that saved everything. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next ones. Leave a like because it helps this story get recommended to more people. See you in the next story.